Despite numerous honors and a life spent in the headlights, John Lennon's time in this world was not blissful. Are you wondering why that happened? What John Lennon's wife just revealed blows everyone's mind. John Lennon has always had the greatest influence on pop culture and music. Together with Paul McCartney, he formed half the best composer duo of all time, but in reality his personal life was a constant stream of chaos and catastrophic events that threw a cruel fate on him and caused in him the unpleasant behavior that his zone today admits. He said he was more popular than Jesus in the Beatles. He was one of the most well-known opponents of war of his era, and the mere mention of his solo career's hits, Imagine, is likely to start playing this song in your head. Just to understand this tragic story of John Lennon's life, let's see why it happened. You can't talk about many tragedies in his life, not to mention how that life ended. On December 8, 1980, Mark David Chapman shot the 40-year-old musician in front of his own home, killing John Lennon. Surprisingly, it wasn't the first time that Lennon and Chapman crossed paths. A young, oddly shy and uncomfortable fan approached Lennon on the street at about 16:30 that day. A fan had the former Beatles album Double Fantasy signed, and Paul Goresh, who was their buddy, took some group shots. Chapman was the fan who, after sending 5 empty balls to the artist less than 6 hours later, while still holding the autographed album, was identified as the fan. Chapman chose Lennon as his target simply because the artist was famous and rich. Despite the kindness that Lennon showed him, he still committed this horrible crime. Chapman began to regret his deed afterwards. The day of Lennon's passing also produced one of his most famous photographs, in which Chapman is conspicuously absent due to an odd camera accident. Famous photographer Annie Leibovitz created the iconic Rolling Stone magazine cover, which features Lennon draping Yoko Ono in her undies on the ground, only hours before Lennon passed away. Julian Lennon, the son of John Lennon's first marriage, is a photographer, singer, documentary filmmaker, and philanthropist. It appears that Julian Lennon inherited his late father's creative genes and tendency to make the world a better place. He is not really fond of his father's public persona as a housekeeper, though. He referred to Lennon as a hypocrite who preached peace on earth but didn't love him or Julian's mother Cynthia in a 1998 interview with The Telegraph. From Julian's point of view, Lennon was a pretty bad father and non-communicative, adulterous head of a family that was eventually separated by a divorce. But Julian does not harbor the same animosity toward his father for the other family of the Beatles, whom John Lennon loved to the degree where he eventually became a householder. He claims to get along well with Sean Lennon, the son of Yoko Ono, even though Sean seems less happy to stay in touch than he does. Despite the fact that he may not always agree with Ono, he also respects Ono herself. If your lifelong songwriting partner and bandmate refers to your entire existence as a call for help, it's likely not a pleasant one. Speaking about their 1965 hit song, Help, that peaked at #1 on the charts, Paul McCartney said precisely the same thing about John Lennon. McCartney bases his appraisal on his knowledge that Lennon always sought help. Lennon's early losses of his mother, father, and uncle, according to McCartney, gave him a delusional sense that people were dying when he was around. Lennon himself verified at least part of his ex-partner's ratings. He once said, "Help was a real cry for help at a time when he was fat and depressed," although he also decided to use the optimistic nature of the song to hide his pain. John Lennon's relationship with his father was tense. Alfred Lennon broke up with Julia Lennon in 1944. Lennon said that he never knew his father and didn't see him too often until he became famous when Alfred mysteriously appeared again. In 1965, the Beatles were at the height of their success, and their manager Tony Cartwright discovered that Alfred was working in a pub. Cartwright transformed Alfred, who himself was a talented musician, into Fred Lennon and tried to turn him into a recording artist. Unfortunately, his unsuccessful debut album disliked younger Lennon, wholly asked his manager Brian Epstein to do everything in his power to stop it. The days of Alfred Lennon's singing soon came to an end, and his album never reached the charts. Only in 1970 did John Lennon get to see his father once more. Taking Alfred's necklace, Lennon, who at the time was using narcotics in addition to primary screaming therapy, yelled at Alfred, ordering his father to go to hell. When Alfred passed away in 1975, Lennon at last admitted to himself that he should have handled their final meeting better. George Toogood Smith was John Lennon's uncle by marriage, and he was actually too good for this world. According to the St. Peter's heritage site, Woolton, Lennon lived with Smith and his wife, Lennon's aunt, Mary Elizabeth Stanley, for most of his childhood. Smith, who had a big impact on Lennon when he was younger, taught the Beatles how to read, paint, and sketch. He even purchased oral organs for the young musician. Sadly, pleasant memories were not intended to remain forever. Smith, then 52 years old, fell in his house in 1955 and passed away from a hepatic hemorrhage. His mausoleum was painstakingly repaired and unveiled in 2015 as a part of Lennon's 75th birthday celebrations, according to Liverpool Echo. It is interesting to note that the Beatles' song Eleanor Rigby may have been indirectly influenced by Smith's passing. According to the BBC, Smith's maid, Eleanor Rigby, had her tomb in the parish cemetery where he was buried. Paul McCartney and John Lennon have both visited the cemetery. While Lennon maintains that he created the character and the name, there are many who believe he may have unintentionally taken the name from the grave. One of the worst moments in John Lennon's life took place on July 15, 1958, when, as the Beatles' Bible says, his mother, Julia Lennon, died in a strange accident. Although the future star lived with her aunt and uncle, Julia and John were close. She supported his musical ventures and even bought him his first guitar. So imagine the shock of 17-year-old Lennon when his mother got married to her aunt and was beaten down by a police officer after work as she was crossing the street on her way to the bus stop. She died immediately. It was a horrible event that left Lennon severely traumatized. From Clegg's perspective, at last he discovered that this woman was the mother of John Lennon, and that Lennon's notoriety continued to remind him of a horrific mishap. After leaving his job to work as a postman, Clegg later learned that Paul McCartney's family had been invited to his celebration. As a result, he was forced to pen hundreds of fan letters to the bandmate of the man whose mother he had killed. Certain memories tend to follow you around no matter what. According to the Salon, John Lennon had a penchant for drugs, and one specific drug may have had a significant negative impact on him to the point where he contributed to the dissolution of the Beatles. In 1969, Lennon was heavily dependent on heroin, and the Fab Four was already plagued by a lot of interpersonal issues. Yoko Ono and John Lennon's open use of opioids at that era of little understanding of the substance led to growing unease among George Harrison, Paul McCartney, and Ringo Starr, who realized that Lennon and Ono were far more distant users than they had previously realized. They were prepared to prevail. While some argue it began earlier, Lennon blames the couple's heroin usage on the real pain they experienced following Ono's 1968 loss. Furthermore, he asserted that using heroin was his method of revolting against the other Beatles and their unwillingness to accept Ono as their equal. Notwithstanding Lennon's prior history of addiction, a severe automobile accident in Scotland turned his heroin use and related mood fluctuations into a serious issue. The other three Beatles recognized that their friend was in pain and had to be cautious around John Lennon due to his explosive rage before the band started recording Abbey Road. They also did not want to question Lennon's insistence on keeping Ono by hand in the studio. The Beatles didn't survive long after Abbey Road. However, Ono and Lennon finally quit heroin. John Lennon may and is a respected artist, but in his personal life he was a brutal man. Unfortunately, this violence has largely spread to women in his life, especially in his youth. In 1980, Lennon almost admitted that he had committed domestic violence in the past and had physically beaten his ex-wife, Cynthia Lennon. He said that the song Getting Better, which contains lyrics about being cruel to my woman, beating her and keeping her away from the things she loved, was about him. I was a ballooner, Lennon admitted. I couldn't express myself and I hit. Lennon added that he had truly believed in love and peace, that he had changed, and that he sincerely regretted his previous deeds. For a socially conscious fan, however, defeating a wife star in the past presents a significant challenge. Furthermore, others questioned if Lennon's violent inclinations also had an impact on Julian Lennon, his firstborn son. Although Julian doesn't say it himself, he did observe that he thought of his father as a hypocrite, who never exhibited the love and tranquility that he taught to everyone else toward him and his mother. In 1973, John Lennon's marriage with Yoko Ono was in crisis. They couldn't shake after Ono's critical disappointment with Lennon some time in New York City, and Ono said that their relationship's continued hatred had ruined their careers. She wanted to take a break from all of this, and she needed a rest from Lennon too. Her solution? She put Lennon on a date with her mistress. Ono and Lennon had an assistant named May Pang, whom Ono trusted and knew that Lennon wanted her, so she offered the couple to make a romance. Unfortunately, Lennon's vision of the case was too lenient. The musician and Pang fled to Los Angeles, where Lennon, suddenly deprived of his wife, began to get rid of all his bad habits, drinking a lot and generally eating Motley Crue for almost 2 years before he and Ono decided to start over in 1975. The musician released no less than 3 albums during this period called The Lost Weekend, and the creative process was usually filled with alcohol and weird. It didn't help that one album, Rock 'n' Roll, was produced by the very unpredictable Phil Spector, who often appeared in strange costumes and once even shot a gun into the ceiling. John Lennon's most famous enemies may have been Paul McCartney and the concept of war, but he had 2 other opponents, probably even more powerful: President Richard Nixon and the FBI. According to Ultimate Classic Rock, around 1971, the office was discouraged by the political activity of the musician and began a 5-year war with the former Beatles. When Lennon showed up at the John Sinclair of the White Panthers protest, the federal files about him were revealed. Lennon was just sentenced to 10 years in jail for the ignominious crime of selling 2 joints of marijuana. Thankfully, Sinclair was freed rather quickly. Regretfully, as a fresh New Yorker, Lennon's attendance at the protest landed him in serious trouble with the FBI. For years, the government has been pursuing Lennon through frequent attempts at deportation and the collection of 300-page music files. President Nixon was involved in the John Lennon FBI files because he thought Lennon's political activities may endanger his chances of winning re-election. But in the end, Lennon made it through the storm. After Nixon's resignation in 1974, due to the Watergate incident, the pressure on the former Beatles gradually lessened. Lennon eventually received a green card in 1976. The Beatles are hardly the first band to be linked to plagiarism allegations. It is reasonable to believe that they are the ones who took advantage of the circumstances. However, according to 1015 WPDH, John Lennon was once accused of being too inspired by a different song. Nor was the song that initially gave rise to the plagiarism accusations an obscure B-side. It was Come Together, one of the most well-known Fab Four tunes and a standout song on Abbey Road. Maurice Levy, a music producer, filed a lawsuit alleging that Lennon promptly stole Chuck Berry's 1956 song, You Can't Catch Maine, for his song Come Together. Levy stated that although Lennon acknowledged being influenced by Berry's song, he had recently published You Can't Catch Maine, and claimed credit for the whole impact. Given that the lines on the 2 songs are quite similar, it is even claimed that Lennon stole portions of the lyrics. Here's the old flat up, it's slowly turning up is how Lennon sings it. Whereas Berry sings here's the flat up, he was riding with Maine. Well, after reaching an out-of-court settlement, Lennon and Levy argued over the specifics of the agreement for the ensuing years. When Levy issued a pirated album using Lennon's old recordings, Lennon reacted. Levy had sued Lennon for not recording one of the 3 tracks that Levy's settlement required recording.